And good evening. Tara Caliendo from Dedicated Managers here again, and I just want to talk about a problem I was having with reactivity in computed properties when you add a new property. So this gave me this was about a 4-hour time suck just figuring out what's going on. It's actually a pretty simple answer. I didn't believe it when I first saw it because of the way my code was working. It seemed to be It seemed to be possible, but it turns out what I was doing made it possible. So I'll go over that in a second. But I want to show first that what I'm trying to do, I'm doing this overhaul, which I can show in my Git repository here. So I created this new branch, and what I'm trying to do is abstract out this primary caregiver function into separate, into a abstracted function that I send primary caregiver so that I can have different types of primary caregivers. Really, technically, I want to have different types of people. So I don't just want to be limited to primary caregiver in my function. So I'll show that here. If we look at the store, when I want to set something, like if I want to initialize something, you notice current primary relative caregiver is part of that function name in my store, right? I'm in the store.js. This is the Vuex storage. So I don't want to have to set, if I have a primary relative caregiver and say I have a secondary relative caregiver or a child entity, I don't want to have to write this initialize function for each one of those. What I want to do is abstract it out and then send in which type I am going to I want to change. So I'll talk about actually that whole transformation that I'm doing in another video. But I just wanted to give a brief interview and say, hey, I'm switching from this hard-coded primary caregiver thing to initialize some kind of entity and send in that entity's state, which is this entity name. And I'll get into that. But my biggest goal is to have it so that I can start out with my storage with this entity being just in a null state. So I want it to be in a null state. I don't want to have to define what the parameters are of all the different entities and all the different forms. Really is what the entities are. It's the client. Like all these views. I don't want to have to define each one of these parameters in my storage, because now I've got to change it in two places. If I go and change and add a new parameter, well, now I got to add it here, and then I got to go into storage and I got to add it to whatever this object is that understands what that is. I just want this thing to be able to be null and pick up on what's happening. But I had this huge problem that took me forever to figure out what was going on, like I said, where actually I'll leave it as null, and then I'll pull the page back up here. So if I save this, you'll see that it loses connectivity and it no longer loads the first name, last name, middle name, all that stuff on this person. It's there. If I go and tell it, give it this key to start with, all of a sudden it works again. So this is killing my reactivity in that when the current entity gets updated, these fields are no longer reactive. They're not reacting to this new property that gets involved. So again, I'll show you that with the null. I'll save it again, and you'll see that that's the only change I made. Now this current entity, which holds all that data, doesn't know anything about that primary relative caregiver property, and so I lose all of the data. And just to hammer that home, take a look at this. If I expand this and I inspect it, and I look at the Vue storage, that might have been too small, you can see that primary relative caregiver object, which is under the current entity, it is set. That data is there, the birth date, all that information that was there is there. It's just not, this is not reactive. These fields are not reactive, so they are not updating when this data object gets loaded. So initially this object isn't there, and then the Firebase code asynchronously goes out and gets this data, and then it puts it in this object that these are tied to, but since they were initially null and this primary relative caregiver object, this property underneath the current entity, since it didn't exist, and I'm just sticking it in there all of a sudden after I go and get that stuff from the Firebase code, it's not reactive, so it's not finding it, even though I'm looking for it and I'm attached to it and checking for it. So, and that's actually in the client view. You can see I'm looking for it. This store state current entity primary relative caregiver. If that exists, then give me the data.firstName property. Well, it does exist. Here's the primary relative caregiver. There's the data property. And then the data object, and the here's the properties. But they, again, it's looking for it, but it's not reactive because it wasn't there on the onset. Interestingly, it turns out that if you add the key, it doesn't work. But if you reset the whole object, which I'll show in a bit in a code pen, you can actually get that to be reactive. But there's even a better way that Vue gives you a helper to actually add a property, an object as a property, and make it reactive. So let's take a look at how I solved this problem. I actually, did some searching on the web and found this thread here. Vuex store properties are not reactive when using a computed property. Well, that's my exact problem. So I found that, and then this guy was trying to do something, and then somebody gave an answer here that said, hey, properties will not be reactive. Here's the code pen that helps you figure out what's going on. So if I open that in a new tab and we take a look at it, so this guy is setting up, let's try and make this a little easier to read. Basically, this is his store here, and he's got a state with a nav object below it. So the nav object is part of the state, and it's an empty object. So and here's the component that's shown up here. So the template here is wide. That's this here, and then it puts out the parameter is wide. What the value of that is. Actually, is wide is a computed function in this local component that says, take a look at the store state nav, which is this thing here, and if the type property of nav is equal to wide, then this is true, so it would return true. If they're equal, it's true. The return returns true. Right now it's returning false because type does not exist on that initially. And then the deal is you're going to click the change type button, and let's look at what that function does. So that changes the where is it? So here's the method for that button, change type, and so it's going to reach out to the store and it's going to add this type property to the nav object, and it's going to give it a value of wide. So you would think that then if this is reactive here, which is this, which is a computed function that comes from here, this should now be this store.nav type equal to wide should equal wide because I set it to wide in this function here. They're the exact same things. So clicking on the button should turn that to false. Well, it doesn't. And that's because it's adding that property after the fact that the property didn't originally exist on this nav. So inserting a property in this object is not reactive. The React can't pick it up. So it comes from here, and you can read about it. Due to the limitations of modern JavaScript and the abandonment of object.observe, Vue cannot detect property addition or deletion. So I saw that in the beginning, and but my code was working, but I was reassigning the whole object, which again I'll hopefully remember to talk about. But so basically here Vue is telling you that you can use this Vue.set function to add the property. So if I go back and I add, instead of change type, if I do this and I go Vue.set, and then I give it the, and I want to set this object with a type property and a value of wide. So now if I don't even have to comment this out, because once this is added, it's now reactive. But so I'll run that, and now I'll click change type and it turns to true. And I don't know if I did that before where I had it the other way, where I was just trying to, where this person was just trying to set the type. I'll run that. I don't know if I clicked the button before, but changing type, I'm clicking it now and that's doing nothing. But if I set it the right way to add the property the right way with the Vue, so this is Vue's way of saying, hey, if you're going to add a property to an object, do it through this to let Vue know to add all its listeners to make it a responsive object. And so if I run that, oops, I think it's run. Now it works. Clicking on it turns it to true. So I actually answered to this article, and I'll go over my answers pretty quick because they said it wasn't possible. They were telling this person that it's not possible, but it is with the Vue, the Vue.set. And so I answered my stream of consciousness down here. So I say, I can't comment on his response above. I don't use Stack Overflow very much, so I'm not allowed to comment yet. I don't have the reputation. So I found, and here's what I was doing in my code that made it seem like it was possible to make start with a null object and have it be reactive when I add a property. So I have basically the same format as them here, except I added some buttons. I've got a change type 2, and a change type 3 button, and we'll talk about what those do real quick. So my buttons, let's make my code a little bit easier to read. So my buttons say it starts out as null, the nav object is null. So if I click the first button, which is change type, it says if the nav object is false, which null is, then turn nav into an object. And then on that object, I'll add the dot type and say now it's wide. So the question is, will this update what it's currently saying it's null? And why is it saying that it's null? Because up here, where I do the computed property for the isWide, I return it's null if the nav object is false. So which it starts out as null. So this is I want to say it's a ternary function. The question mark function says that if this thing is true, run this thing. If it's false, run this side of the colon. So right now, when I initially start out, this.store.state.nav is a null object. It's null, so that's false. So it runs the false side, which says it's null. So that's why it's null. Now back to this change type function. So if I click this button, like I was saying, the question is, if it's not reactive, because adding a property here should not be reactive. If I click this button, then I'm adding the type property. So that's a new thing that shouldn't update here because this should not be reactive. This should not be reacting to changes because it shouldn't be part of the Vue's reactive object engine. So let's try that. I click it, but it does work, which is interesting. So this is what was throwing me for a loop, and it turns out I think that the reason that it let it change here is because the original object changed, and then I add that type, and I think it queues it before the React takes a look at it, and so it ends up in that instance just for that brief second updating. But now I've got this change type 2 function, which is now going to update this same object, this same property on the object. This is the exact same thing, and now I'm going to say now it's wider when I click this. And then this was just to try and add another property to see if maybe that helped boost changing things. It's really irrelevant because it didn't help. But so you would hope that clicking that, because this was reactive, you would think that now if I update type, the same thing that I just updated here, you would think that it's going to work. And so if I click, and let me open the console because obviously I put some console stuff out, and I'll clear that. So when I click change type 2, you would expect it to update. Now it's wider. I say now it's wider because that's outputting this right here. The first console is outputting the type. So the object has changed. The global object, the store global object has changed. That type is now it's wider, but it didn't get updated in the screen, in the reactive component, because it's not truly reactive. And so this is kind of the situation I was in. But what I was doing is when I was setting when I was updating the object like this, I was actually giving that nav a whole new object, and that actually turns out to cause everything to become reactive now. So if I run this from the beginning again, so that's going to start it over, and I click change type, that works. Change type 2 doesn't work, so it's apparently not reactive, even though I changed it to wider. And now I'm going to give it a whole new object of type. So now if I give it a whole new object, there you go. Now it's reactive. And interestingly, now it's backwards compatible in that now all of a sudden, because this type got assigned to the nav object as an object, this whole object got assigned to this. Now everything below it is going to be known to Vue as reactive. It's able to do its thing. So because I'm setting the root object and not a property on the object, I'm setting the object with a bunch of properties. That's fine. Now all of a sudden, if we watch, type 2 is now reactive, and so is this one. So now I can go between the two, and suddenly they're reactive because now this type is there and it's been passed through Vue's functionality to make it reactive. It's here in these cases before I do this, but it's not being passed through reactive's process to make it reactive. So that's how my project was working, in that I was assigning this whole new object, but then getting back to my entity thing here, where did I store my current entity? Before, in the old code, I would update this object entirely, but now I'm adding properties. That's what this does right here, is state.currentEntity. When you give it a, I could put a dot and then the name, but because I'm using a variable, it's easier to use the brackets. But this still adds a property to the current entity, and it adds a property based on what I'm passing in. And if you recall, I wanted to pass in, instead of having a function like this with the name embedded, I wanted to generalize it to an entity, so I can have a bunch of different entities, and then pass in this current primary relative caregiver, which ultimately gets passed in as part of this entity container object, which is the name. And I'll talk about that again in another video. But basically it comes down to this stopped working here because I'm adding up, instead of creating a new object here that it's seeing, I'm adding to the object, adding a new property. So that's why I had to do this to get it to work, as opposed to this. If you go back and look at the beginning, this didn't work, but this worked. Because now when it's like this, it starts out like this. Vue understands that there's a key there or a property there and knows to look for it and make it reactive. So what ultimately I have to do down here where I initialize this entity is I shouldn't set it like this. I have to pass it through that Vue.set function that I showed earlier in my CodePen. Where is it here? This Vue.set. So I'm going to have to do that in my code. So I'll do that, and then I'll update what happened. You know, this major change that I'm doing, I'll describe what's actually happening here. So long story again, Terry Caliendo for Dedicated Managers. Just I've spent, you know, this has been a time suck. This dragged me in for about I'd say about 4 hours. I've been playing with this and doing CodePens and just playing around. So hopefully, if somebody finds this, you know, this is a quick, a much easier way to understand. Hopefully it's understandable, that you can figure out, solve your problem much easier. So again, Terry Caliendo, it is Saturday night and I am coding because my wife's out of town and my son's in bed. So happy me. Anyway, take care, have a great day, and happy coding.